Good afternoon, everyone. So, how can we break silos? That's a central question today. And to answer that question, I feel privileged to introduce a panel, a very distinguished panel, and I very much hope that we will get some answers with that panel, and also a message of hope and ambition. Let me perhaps first turn to our first distinguished member of the panel, Mr. Wael Maïdan. Mr. Wael Maïdan is the director of Climate Action Network. It's the biggest NGO network coordinating on climate change policy. It includes more than 700 members working in more than 160 countries. Wael has more than 16 years of experience in social and environmental campaigning in the Arab world and globally. His work on this issue started in his capacity as the Greenpeace campaigner for the Arab world. So, very pleased to have you on board. And so, how do you think we could break silos?
Sure. First, thank you for the invitation, being here, and it's always a pleasure to be involved in such occasions. We've been part of this consultation process and started, and we think it was very useful. What I try to provide is a bit an overview of how we look at things, and hopefully we can, in discussions, then go into the details of it. First, in terms of breaking the silos, we see the silos as being politically constructed. And I think it's done because also related to human nature and how we need to organize information in our heads and how we deal with big problems. We try to put them in different boxes so we can handle the information. This is good because it provides us with the ability to digest complex problems and make it easier. But at the same time, we create other problems, and that's why breaking the silos, we feel is necessary at this point of time. Creating the silos and dividing an environment and development makes them look at two separate issues that we can deal with each one on their own. And that's what we've been trying to do in the past 20 years, is to try to see how they don't compete with each other. So, in the past 20 years, we look at them, two things are completely competing, that if we want to care for the environment, we're going to hinder development, and we need to develop first, and so we'll be able to deal with environmental challenges, which is, unfortunately, we heard it's still part of the debate happening right now. But in reality, in nature or in science, they are completely not separated. To give a very simple example, now climate science clearly says that it is not possible to achieve poverty elimination if we don't address climate change. Actually, climate change and such environmental problems will be hindering some of the developmental gains we've achieved, and if we continue like this, all developmental gains achieved will go back, not only in developing countries, but in the future as well in developed countries. So now if we want to address the development question, how are we going to achieve development, we have to address climate change. So environmental issues are developmental issues. They are part of, we're not trying to protect the climate for the sake of climate. We're not trying to protect the stocks in the sea, fish stocks in the sea for the sake of the fish. We're trying to do it for the benefit of human society. And this is where the problem, we need to get into the political system where we cannot address one without addressing the other. We talk about it a lot, it exists in many reports, but still it did not distill into the political discussion. And this is where we need to work first. We talk about transformational change and the new goals. And here, where it's an opportunity to do it, we need to redefine development. Because development came at the beginning for the right reason, which is improving quality of life. Through earlier discussions, the improved quality of life was through economic development, i.e. growth. And actually, as civil society for us, the word growth is a bit of a problem. We prefer development because growth is, something becoming bigger. And becoming bigger doesn't really necessarily, it means improved quality of life. For me, for example, growth in your neck, something we don't want. Development is more of improving something, making it better, such as like Pokemon evolving from one stage to another. It's something good, something positive. To illustrate very clearly how a problem happens when we're trying to address development through growth. We have some poor communities living in rural areas. And they have problems, such as their crops are failing, their water is not clean, which are clearly environmental problems. But when we try to address these from a growth perspective, we provide them a job in an urban area, in a factory, which actually, even if they move from this bad environment to this more income generating environment, it doesn't mean improved quality of life. They might be less happy moving into the slums of city, away from their families and tradition and culture, yes, making more money, but having other kinds of problems. What we would see, what they really want and would prefer is removing the poisons from their water, ensuring that climate change doesn't affect their crops, and this is the real development. It's not only in terms of growth. And so redefining development and how we measure development, not through the GDP, but other means that we can make countries compete on who is more developed, not based on their size of economy, but more on the improved quality of life directly. These are very tough questions to achieve, and it's politically we all know that we have a challenge that we lack global leadership in terms of countries as a whole and the whole high-level political system. And to address this lack of leadership, unfortunately what we have seen been happening that people are trying to avoid asking the tough questions. And we see it everywhere in every kind of negotiation sessions. They try, after the failure of Copenhagen, there is such fear from having high expectations that we try to avoid it as much as possible. So we try to manage expectation in every negotiations now. Let's leave the difficult subjects away from this negotiation. Let's try to have acceptable objectives. And I think this is a problem. We, instead of trying to avoid dealing with tough questions, we need to know how to deal with failure or not meeting the expectation. It's fine. Yes, we need to always try to ask the good questions, but not be disappointed, collapse, think that at the end of the world, if we don't achieve the objectives we want, we need to keep trying. Otherwise, we're not going to solve problems. Another problem we're seeing is that because of this lack of leadership, there's a tendency to go towards the private sector, even NGOs. Maybe we can find solutions there. Well, if you come to NGOs directly, we're going to say the problem is you. We're going to say the lack of leadership. So if you want access for using solutions, we're going to be saying, well, you need to change. We need to find new political leaders. And private sector, you control the private sector very easily. You set the boundaries and the framework for private sector on how they need to behave. And it's better for you to control that than the private sector to control it, in our opinion. For example, shifting fossil fuel subsidies, reforming them, and making sure that the poor benefit rather than the rich, which is the case right now. The carbon tax, feed-in tariffs. This is the thing that are going to drive the private sector. Going to the private sector to find solution, if they don't find clear economical gain out of really solving the problem, they're not going to solve it. It's their survival depends on it. So, finally, I've heard a lot in relation to terming sustainability as a space or as a capital that we need to share. And I think here we have to be very careful. The minute we frame it this way, you show that there's a cake that has a size and we need to divide it. And this is where I fear that it might become a problem. We don't look, this is the problem of the global commons that countries out of the current political system, which is national interest, everyone wants to get the biggest size of the cake, piece of the cake as possible. And here we need to look at it as an opportunity, reshape the discussion as an opportunity, as not a burden that we need to share, but something, a future we want for future generations, and a better quality of life, and make it more as a positive direction rather than dividing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think quite right, we should really keep the high expectations and try to turn this game into a win-win game. If I can do a commercial for my government, that's actually what we're trying to do. Precisely what we call in French agenda positif. So trying to show environment as something that could create opportunities rather than just a burden sharing exercise. But anyway, thank you so much. And I think one of the answer has also to do with getting the science right. And you really need to make sure that this is the case. And so I'm really glad to have with us Ivo Avinga, and he is Assistant Director of United Nations Statistics Division. He has worked extensively on the coordination of the global statistical system through the United Nations Statistical Commission on a range of matters related to the drafting and consultation on international statistical standards. And during his career prior to the United Nations, he has developed an extensive expertise in the strengthening of institutional and statistical capacity of national systems in response to national policy priorities. So I think he's really the right person to make sure that we have the good science that we really need. Ivo, thank you.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It is for me a great pleasure and honor being invited here, basically being part of that open working group consultation. And we really look forward to continue this early engagement of statisticians in the world of policy. And I want to talk a little bit about how we basically will be able to assist you in your consultations around these issues of choices to be made on the sustainable development goal framework, as well as other sort of areas that you are consulting on in the broader measures of progress. Basically, as statisticians, we look very much at the issues at hand, and there are quite a number, and we have to provide these responses. Now, this is a whole list that run on economic issues, on growth, on deficits and debts. These are issues around the environment and its sustainability. These are issues around social development and inclusions and equity. Next slide. All these different sort of challenges are casted by the different organizations in different kind of frameworks, policy frameworks that they develop. A big one in this area is green economy, green growth. Of course, our own post-2015 development agenda. There are issues regarding what we call natural capital accounting. I'll talk a little bit about that. It is also about issues around biodiversity that come from the conventions, for instance, on biodiversity. There are issues of UNDP, and we have seen that also on the video of the Poverty and Environment Initiative. There are issues of UNEP that works on TEEP, on the economy of ecosystem and biodiversity, and the latest development, which is called Vantage, which is about the valuation of ecosystem services. All these policy frameworks have one thing in common, is that they want to see the trade-offs between the different sort of elements in the economy and in the society and in the environment. Next slide, please. In order to inform that, the Rio +20 outcome document very clearly requested the Statistical Commission of Official Statisticians, that is that commission that is functioning under ECOSOC, to provide a program of work on the broader measures of progress. And basically that is at the heart of the matter where we talk about today, and we'll be talking about in formulating the SDG framework as well as the post-2015 agenda. When we think back on these issues in the shaping of these frameworks, we can immediately touch back on the Millennium Development Goal framework when it was developed. And that was a very important sort of development also for the statistics, to basically being linked to policy. But where we saw that at that time we were basically called into the room when that whole policy framework was basically shaped, and then they said, statisticians in the world, now you measure. That's, we were taken aback a little bit from it, because that was not easy, right? because there was a tall order was placed. These were very highly important sort of goal-setting environment that galvanized our process, but then it comes to the measurement, it is sometimes not very easy. So we want to be there now, right from the start, so that we can inform these debates around issues of measurement, along the issues of policy and the trade-off that you want to look at, also in the integrated manner, because the trade-offs are not anymore in the silo of economy and the environment and the society. It is about that cross-cutting integration that we're looking at. I mentioned that in the MDGs, we know it was a more sort of social agenda. Now we really want to, push much more broader the economic and societal aspect of it. We are also much more aware about, the reporting against the MDG framework and how far we have come, but at the same time also how much is still to be done, and we have to take that into account when we talk about that. Next slide. And in particularly, we also want to make sure that the agenda is made in such a way that we can get a leadership role also around not only the policy but also around the national statistical system, and particularly we think that national statistical offices have a role to play as an overall sort of coordinator in that overall space of informing about the economy, society and the environment. And we need to strengthen that capacity going forward. Now, in order to do that, the agenda, and we have used these words many times over, it really needs a fundamental rethink about how we set up our statistical system. If you look at how we have set up, for instance, the MDG monitoring framework, it is very much an ad hoc approach, where we really said, okay, we want to measure certain goals and targets, how important they are in education and in health and water and so on, but these were very stovepipe approaches. It didn't develop, let's say, that broader statistical system that we really want to aspire. And it is important that we have that understanding that we have to do that in a more sort of broader sense of bringing these different departments and ministries that work in the economy and in the environment and society together informing a more credible integrated statistical system. Now we have to think about that, next slide, also in terms of, but that's too fast, one slide back. In the way we think about it, it's not only a discussion that you will have with the statistician. The statisticians have to reach out also to the parliamentarians. So why do we need to do that? It's because we need to have the legal mandates and the allocation of budgets that are necessary for us to basically develop these credible systems and this autonomy in measurement, which is a very important aspect in that transformation, because you want to have trusted and credible institutions that support that. You want to talk also with academia and think tanks, because thinking about an information society in countries that are emerging and are developing also requires that fundamental thinking about that use of statistics. It's not only about generating the statistics, and even if they are with high quality and high frequency, it is also about understanding that use of that policy statistic in a discourse, that is, in thinking this in an integrated policy framework. And if you look at the present frameworks as we have them, again, they're very much stovepiped in many countries, so they can develop something for the water sector, they can develop something for the food sector, they can develop something for great things like, balanced budgets of the government. They're very important, and macroeconomic stability, but these are very stovepiped approaches. And now we have to start to think about how do you bring these systems together. And we as statisticians have to do that also not alone from the statistical soundness, the scientific soundness of statistics, but also from the theoretical soundness. So we have to have the economic theories explaining on what we're doing, the environmental understanding of how ecosystems work, have to feed into that process of decision making. So it is also about that broader sort of partnership that we have to think about when we talk about generating statistics or even putting up a policy framework in which we would like to shape our future. So it is a broad base, what they call data revolution. It's a very important term, and we're working on that to bring that partnership together in joining hands together in all these different sort of environments. I mentioned think tank in terms of civil societies also that have to be thought about, and we're actually working now in thinking this through. Now my final slide I want to bring about. This is a slide that basically sets about that we have done our homework. The system of national accounts, which is the system for economic statistics, is this book. It's about, this has been the latest revision. We just revised it in 2008, and it has been tested against the economic and financial crisis. It does work, so don't worry about that. We have done our homework. Now, this is already 60 years old. This one is a more recent sort of delivery. It's the system of environmental economic accounts. This is also an international standard. So this is not anymore discussion about what sort of information are we going to select for the economy or for the environment and the link to the environment and economy and society. We do have them. So don't think that we have to develop new conceptual frameworks. We have done our work over the last decade to do that. We even have an experimental development on ecosystems and how to measure that, and we are working increasingly also with those that work in that area. So it is important to know that on the basis of, for instance, only a couple of our major international standards, we are able, at present rate, as we look at the indicators that are being discussed at the moment more broadly in the different sort of initiatives, we can identify 60 to 70% of all the agents simply by using these macroeconomic, what we call macroeconomic counts on the economy and the environment. And we therefore think that we are well placed to have that discussion about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the science is there, and the civil society is there. So now we need strong political leadership. And here we have a pleasure to have with us Paula Caballero. Well, I think she needs no introduction here, but anyway, she currently serves as Director of Economic, Social and Environmental Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, where she leads a multidisciplinary team that covers a major multilateral negotiation and agreement, including work on the post-2015 framework. She actually, I think she initiated a proposal on SDGs, on Sustainable Development Goals, in the Rio +20 process. She currently serves on the Open Working Group on the SDGs. And professional background that also includes work for the UNDP and as professor of international law at Andes University, Colombia. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. Good afternoon to everybody. I hope everybody's not missing their lunch because of this. So we better come up with, I think so far it's been a very substantive discussion, which is worth it if you're missing lunch for it. So let me see what I can add to make up for the lost lunch. I'm really happy to come after Wael and Ivo because they've addressed some very basic issues that very much reflect the work that Colombia is doing in the middle of these negotiations. Let me start off by saying that we strongly endorse the call for statisticians to be in the room from the very day from the word go. We did a very interesting work on the big data revolution in Colombia earlier this year, a big international conference, and we're hoping to have a follow-up with that. So we're working very, very closely with Ivo and the rest of the statisticians around because they have to be part of defining that new agenda. What is the first silo we have to break down, which is unbelievable that we even have to break down that silo, but it's out there, and it's this concept that poverty and sustainable development somehow operate in parallel universes. And so that's the first cycle that we all have to convert it, and it's not everybody by a stretch of the imagination have got to break down that silo. Hand in hand with that silo is with that silo approach to poverty and sustainable development is what I call this pro-poor minimalist agenda. This idea that somehow you can tick off poverty by ticking it off in a little corner and sort of patting some people on the back or throwing something there, without really addressing the root causes of poverty, without really looking at all the shades of inequality that there are out there. So we very much object to that minimalist approach, and we think that that minimalist approach is also very much reflected in this call for MDG+. Let's finish the job on the MDGs. You can't finish the job on the MDGs. We have to keep accelerating and working on the MDGs, and the MDG targets have to remain priorities. But we're never going to reduce maternal mortality unless we take care of education, we construct the hospitals, the road that leads to the hospital, we have energy, so that there's energy and doctors and nurses and antibiotics in the hospitals. And you don't do that with a minimalist approach. So we really think that the biggest silo, as I said, to break down is the silo between poverty and sustainable development. Between poverty and thinking that somehow you can deal with poverty in a little cubby hole without understanding what we call today the rural nexus. access to markets, and everything you need to really bring up the standard of living in the rural setting, and also deal with slums in the same way. And it's different challenges. They're very much interlinked, but they're challenges that we have to address. And so those silos are also silos that we have to break down. I like very much, and we subscribe fully to what I was saying about redefining development. My minister and the high-level panel kept calling for, what do we understand by prosperity? What is prosperity? Prosperity is sustainable consumption and production patterns of the type that are prevalent in Western societies, that clearly there's no room for prosperity in a planet with 9 billion people. So how do we rethink prosperity? And where does equity come into it? Not only equity within countries, because there are deep inequalities even in my country, and that's why I want to talk about something else that we're doing there. But also between countries. And I said today, this morning, this has to be an agenda of convergence. And how do you do that convergence? But that convergence is about all the convergence in the future. It's a convergence for future generations. So we were very strongly supporting calls for intergenerational equity in Warsaw, which, by the way, we do not think was a very happy result in terms of really driving forward the ambitious agenda we need. This is just parenthetical, but people keep talking of a 2-degree goal. IPCC is telling us very clearly that the window closes next year, so we really need to start talking about a 3-degree goal or a 4-degree goal, for which there is no easy adaptation. So that's just a parenthetical, I guess, venting on the side about climate change. So back to what we were talking here, why do we need to redefine development? Because obviously, from our perspective, sustainable development doesn't work because of the silos that we've all been talking about. So how we break down those silos, and I said that in Rio, is what happens the day after, Rio +1, not Rio +20, Rio +1, and what happens now with post-20 +1. When I come home from New York with whatever it is that we negotiate here, I want my line ministries to say, wow, this is a great instrument, it's going to help us deliver, not what in the world are you guys doing, what are we supposed to do with this? And that's probably what we're going to end up with unless we have a very simple way